Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in Jennifer Schaus and Associates complimentary webinar series for U.S. federal government contractors. We're coming to you live from Washington, D.C. This webinar series will run for 15 weeks or 15 Wednesdays as we cover subcontracting opportunities within each of the federal departments. As usual, all of these webinars are complimentary. You can find the schedule, registration links, and recordings on our website under the subcontracting section. Our data partner each week is GovSpend, formerly FedMine, and our legal perspective will be covered by a rotating government contracts attorney each Wednesday. So a little bit more about us. As you can see on the slide, we provide the following services for federal contractors, including product, service, and software firms across the globe. You can find more information about us on our website. Our webinars and newsletters reach a vast array of federal contractors, and our YouTube channel now has almost 600 complimentary webinars. So please follow our channel and give our videos a like or comment. And we also offer advertising opportunities, including in this series. So if your organization is interested in reaching federal contractors, you can also sponsor an event, our webinars, advertise in our newsletter, or have us post your promotional information on LinkedIn. So contact us at hello@jenniferschaus.com for pricing and our media kit if you're interested. And speaking of sponsors, we'd like to take a moment to personally thank the organizations that help make this series possible. A special thanks to Tom Johnson and the team at Set Aside Alert for posting this webinar series in their newsletter. Please visit setasidealert.com to learn about their services for small businesses. And additionally, we'd like to thank GovEvents and also Fairfax County for sharing this webinar series on their public calendars. So please also visit their websites and calendars for other related events. And we would like to thank the Virginia PTAC. Virginia PTAC is based out of GMU in Fairfax, Virginia. They offer free one-on-one counseling on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on your business location. So if you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to contact the PTAC. And thanks to our friends at BidSpeed, the BidSpeed platform helps you win and increase your probability of winning government contracts. They have opportunities from every federal, state, and local public source in the US. If you're looking for a compliance matrix, a proposal template, a strategic teaming partner, or details on an expiring contract, BidSpeed can help. BidSpeed is an official partner of the SBA's 7J Management and Technical Assistance Program. So contact BidSpeed at the email or phone number here to learn more. And thank you to Gov White Papers, an online resource for content. Gov White Papers is a free knowledge hub for the public sector and supporting industries to find, post, and promote government and military-related content. Explore B2G advertising solutions with our team of government marketers so you can connect with public sector decision makers. Promotional opportunities include lead generation, display ads, white label content creation, email marketing, and more. Browse thousands of free white papers, ebooks, case studies, and more to stay informed on topics like economy, healthcare, procurement, supply chain, and education. Plus, upload your content for free to boost website traffic and exposure in the government community. Join Gov White Papers today to get started. Okay, so today we're all here to dig into subcontracting opportunities at the Department of Commerce. So first, let's take a quick look at our agenda. As you can see, we'll be starting with our panelist introductions and we'll close out with legal insights. So our first panelist today is Ms. Archisa Meehan representing GovSpend. GovSpend is the go-to resource for finding federal contracting opportunities. So please contact Archisa for more information about GovSpend platform. Thank you, Archisa, for being with us as always.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and our legal speaker today is Sarah Osborne. Sarah is a federal contracts attorney at Bradley LLP. Thank you, Sarah, for being with us.
Thank you guys, look forward to it.
All right, and with that, we're just going to quickly put up the mission statement and history of the Department of Commerce. I won't go through everything here, but as you can see, really focused on economic growth, domestic industry. We've highlighted some keywords, so go ahead and keep that in mind as we look at the subcontracting opportunities. And then here's just a quick look at the various agencies and services within the department. We encourage you to spend some time on each of these websites to learn more about each bureau agency and their specific mission as well. And then here are some important links providing information on the department's small business office. So there's the main link to the department, and then the link to the OSBU, and then the procurement forecast. Make sure you review the procurement forecast to understand what the department is buying, when they're buying it, how much they're buying, and if any specific set aside or contract vehicle may be used. And then lastly, the SBA scorecard can help you understand the small business contracting trends and what dollars are being won by women, veterans, hub zone firms, and other disadvantaged businesses. So make sure you take a look at those links as well. So now let's take a look at the top 10 vendors for the department. I'm not going to read these off because in a second we're going to look at the top 5 in detail with Archisa. So now we're going to go into the profiles of the top 5. So Archisa, I will pass it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Archisha Meehan, and I'm the Director of Federal at GovSpend and FedMine. And it's really nice to be here and talk through some of the top companies or vendors at the Department of Commerce. And the reason why we're really looking at is as we're sort of trying to understand our strategy and figure out who can we work with as a subcontractor, it is important to understand the top companies and see the type of work that they do, how are they getting the dollars, things of that nature, and also be educated as we approach the small business offices within these organizations. So the first one that we're looking at is Raytheon Technology and Information Services. Let's go to the next slide. Here is the link to the contact page. As you're talking to them, would highly recommend that you also talk to their small business officer if they have one liaison office. So let's go to the next page, next slide. So what we did was we said, let's look at the dollars that Reed is winning year over year, and you could see that they have grown from $208 million in 2020. They went down a little bit to $175 million. But as of last week, they were at about $185 million of contracts that they received from the Department of Commerce. And when we look at the Bureau specifically, they received the money from the US Patent and Trademark Office. That really, in this case, Commerce is definitely their primary agency that this company is working with. Let's go to the next slide. And if we go further in, you could see that this contract was really awarded for patent data and document management. In terms of the NAICS codes that the contract's awarded under, it's as all other publishers. So as a small business looking for subcontracting, this is the type of information that I would want to search for. Many times there will be a subcontract requirement that is in that transactional detail that on an award. And if that is the case, I think, again, that's a great way for you to reach out to the company. So let's go to the next slide, which is L3 Harris. Next slide. Here is the link to their SBLO to register, and I would recommend you definitely register as a small business vendor with them if this, if you are looking to develop subcontracting opportunities at the Department of Commerce. Let's go to the next slide. And in this case, as we're looking at the contracting trends, L3 has many subsidiaries. We're specifically looking at the subsidiary that won the prime contracts at the Department of Commerce. And I have, just for information and clarity, put in the SAM UEI number. So let's go to the next slide. This is a look at how this specific L3 Harris subsidiary has performed year over year, with definitely the Department of Commerce being one of the largest customers. Their overall spend, as you could see, is in the $500+ million. Let's go to the next slide. And you could see that the Department of Commerce for FY21 was at about $170 million, with NOAA being the main bureau that they are working with. In terms of the various NAICS codes that the company has won contracts under, you could see there's a lot in terms of navigation guidance, computer systems, and R&D in the physical engineering and life sciences. So let's go to the next slide. I also decided that but you could also go in and see the subcontracts that the company has been winning, as and you could see, this is just to give you a quick look at some of the data that is available as you are trying to understand more about a company. So let's go to the next slide, which takes us to company number 3, which is T-Rex Solutions. Next slide. Link to the, their information. Next slide. And let's look at T-Rex specifically with the Department of Commerce. In 2020, they were at about $500 million, mainly at Census Bureau. That definitely is a major contract for them. In 2021, they were about $150 million at U.S. Census Bureau, and this amount definitely has fallen now. I guess at the Census Bureau. Let's go to the next slide. This is the contract requirement that they had. So they were providing the enterprise solutions framework for systems engineering, specifically at the Census Bureau under the 541512 NAICS code. Again, if this is, this data helps you create those relationships with the primes, understand the type of work that they're doing at the agency, when does that contract end, are they working with any other companies, how is the work going, allows you to get that information before you go to the company and start your conversations with them. I think always going from the knowledge perspective is really helpful to have a meaningful conversation. So let's go to the next slide, which takes us to Raytheon Technologies. Again, this is their link to register as a small business vendor and the SBLOs and the supplier diversity program. So looking at Raytheon year over year, you could see they are definitely a large company that has many subsidiaries. And you could see that the Navy, Air Force, Army, Defense are their primary clients, with all the other agencies falling into that tiny sliver. Let's go to the next slide. And this is looking at the contracts that they have won specifically at the Department of Commerce, with NOAA being the primary bureau, followed by the Office of Secretary. Whenever we see negative or deobligations, in my mind, typically it could be contract closeouts. But we are really focusing on the contract that they have at NOAA. Let's go to the next slide. And you could further go in and see the type of NAICS codes that that Raytheon is winning the contracts under. Again, navigation and R&D, especially when you're working with NOAA, all fits in. Next slide. You could also see that these are some of the subcontractors that Raytheon is working with. gives you that clarity. So, this is just a quick look at showing you who are the subcontractors that Raytheon is working with. And this is coming from data that is in USA spending, which really gets its information from FSRS. So next slide. And then that brings us to our last company when we look at the top 5 to Accenture Federal. Next slide. Again, a link to where you could register or their small business liaison information. And looking at again at the total federal agency work that they're doing, you could see that top agencies, education, homeland, state, HHS, they're major ones, but the others constitute more than 50% of the contracts that they've been winning. And in FY21, they won more than $2.5 billion in contracts, and looks like 2022 is also going well. Let's go to the next slide. Looking at the work that they are doing at Department of Commerce, they were at about $104 million, with work really being distributed at the Census Bureau, PTO, and Office of Secretary, with NOAA getting some contracts there too. So it's a little more distributed than our other companies that we looked at. And FY22, they definitely seem to be on an upward trend, specifically at the US PTO. So let's go to the next slide. And this is, a quick look at the type of work that they're doing at NOAA, whether it's business application solutions or using AI in there at the US PTO. So this is just giving you a good look at the type of work that they're doing within the Department of Commerce. Obviously, you can go further into details, understand if there are existing subcontractors or if there are subcontract requirements. It's also important to understand and see the contracts that they might be getting on vehicles or GSA schedules. So let's go to the next slide. And then further looking at the NAICS codes, are a little different than the other two, Raytheon and I think L3 that we saw, in terms of the NAICS codes that are being used, a lot more focused on computer system design services and computer-related services. So let's go to the next slide. And I think with that, Madeline, it's back to you.
Yes, thank you, Archisa, for all the great data and insights and for your time, as always. So now we're going to go into some marketing best practices. So we've listed here the basics for marketing your services to the top primes. Most importantly, you should use the tools available on sam.gov or on the GovSpend platform to conduct research on the primes and the expiring contracts. Use the primes website, their newsletter and events calendars, as well as social media to learn more about them and then connect with them. It's really important to do that background research first. Lastly, set yourself apart and lead with your capabilities, not your socioeconomic status. Bring a specific opportunity to the prime and work with the SBLOs, the small business liaison officers. They're your advocates, so make sure that you're working with them. All right, and now we'll go over legal considerations and best practices. Please note we've covered the federal acquisition regulations on the Department of Commerce earlier this year, so you can find the YouTube recording there at that link. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Osborne. Thank you for being with us, Sarah.
Much. Hi, everyone. So as we mentioned at the beginning, I'm Sarah Osborne. I'm an attorney at the firm Bradley. We have offices in DC. I'm actually based in Huntsville, Alabama. So we've got a big contracting community down here with the Army Contracting Command and NASA and other DoD agencies and contractors. So specialize in government contracts and represent a lot of subcontractors. So we'll be talking today a little bit about legal issues and flow downs from the subcontractor's perspective. So next slide, please. So when we are contracting, we're talking about federal contracting requirements. Typically what we're referring to, and you've probably heard before, is discussion about the FAR, so the Federal Acquisition Regulation. Agencies have supplements, which we just mentioned. There's the Commerce Acquisition Regulations, which we're not going to go over in detail today. Usually an agency under the Department of Commerce is going to use FAR clauses and then include the CAR supplement where applicable in your solicitations. And you'll see that as a subcontractor in the way that the prime contractor flows those requirements down to you. One other potential requirement to be aware of are executive orders that may apply to your contract. And I'll get into that here in a moment. Next slide, please. So when you are a subcontractor under a government contract, remember that your contract is with the prime. So although you're going to have requirements and obligations that relate to the government and are basically creatures of statute or regulation, all of those requirements have to be flowed down to you through your prime contract. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today are negotiations between you, the subcontractor, and the prime contractor. I will note that, especially with the Department of Commerce, some of these agencies and the lower level sub-agencies, you're going to be doing commercial work as a subcontractor. So just be mindful that if you're providing commercial services or commercial goods, the same, off-the-shelf items that you would provide to any public buyer, you may not be subject to as many requirements or as many flow downs as you would expect if you are specifically tailoring your engineering or your goods to a government contract. So that's just something to be mindful of. Next slide, please. So we hear about flow downs, but when do they actually apply is something that, as a savvy subcontractor that's going to be negotiating with the prime, you want to have a handle on what you can negotiate out of your subcontract and what you just can't. There are some rules that the government imposes on anyone that's going to do business with the U.S. government or with a prime contractor under a U.S. government contract that we can't get around. Those are typically called mandatory flow downs. So there's no one size fits all. I can't send you to a list of all the mandatory flow downs that you should expect to see if you're going to subcontract under a government contract. Instead, these mandatory flow downs typically depend on things like the contract type. Is it fixed price? Is it cost type? The size of the contract. Some FAR requirements apply if the order is over $200,000, but wouldn't apply to something that's under that. So the subject matter also may be a trigger for a different type of flow down or whether or not it's mandatory. So is it a services contract? Is it CONUS? Is it in the United States? Are we dealing with potentially export control data? So what you want to look for with the flow down, and we'll talk about this, the flow down typically, if you've not seen it before, is going to look like a list of FAR clauses or a list of contract terms that are from the prime contract. So in your subcontract, you'll see the prime say, here's a list of FAR clauses or CAR clauses or agency requirements that we are flowing down from the prime, and we expect you, subcontractor, to perform in accordance with these clauses. So oftentimes that's just a list of, if you haven't seen it before, of numbers and names of clauses. So, it may say FAR 52.222-13. If you've never read that clause before, that's essentially nonsense to you. So you have to go read the clause, and if you read the clause, it will tell you, it will prescribe when that clause is a mandatory flow down. So when the prime doesn't have discretion to negotiate one way or the other, has to include that clause in your subcontract. Similarly, there may be clauses that are, quote, necessary, so a necessary flow down, meaning you can't perform under the contract as a practical matter unless you comply with those clauses. And an easy one kind of conceptually to wrap your head around is like, let's say you have a subcontract where you're going to physically have to go on to a NOAA-based facility or a NOAA facility. If your employees will have to meet specific requirements to get access to that facility, a background check, US citizenship, things of that nature. that would be an example of a necessary flow down, meaning your employees could not perform under the contract unless they meet the obligations under that flow down. So these mandatory and necessary flow downs are the types that we really can't negotiate out of a subcontract, but we want to be mindful of because, right, we need to know what our obligations are as a subcontractor and what potentially we don't have to comply with and could negotiate out. Because, you know, if you had to comply with every single FAR clause that, for instance, a Raytheon complies with on a $100 million prime contract, that would necessarily make your work much more expensive because that's a lot of requirements that will require a lot of administrative work on your time, on your part. So next slide, please. So it is so imperative that you understand what the clauses say, because you as a subcontractor take on the risk of non-compliance, even if the prime doesn't take the time to explain something to you, or if they say, you know, if they reference a document but don't provide it, there's a risk that you may be held to what's in that reference document, even though you never received it. So we want to make sure we read all the clauses, we read all the reference documents, and we know what they say. So I've put some examples in here. So 52222-55, this is minimum wages for contractor workers under Executive Order 14026. You may see this and think minimum wage, I pay my employees minimum wage. But if you're not familiar with the executive order, the president has set a minimum wage for, a minimum wage for contractors performing under a contract with the United States at $15 an hour, starting January 30, 2022. So, and there are some exceptions, and again, you need to read the clause to make sure it actually applies to your work, but this is an example of we need to go into the clause, read it, and make sure that we understand what's actually being asked of us as a subcontractor and if we can apply. And maybe even more fundamentally, that we're pricing our work consistent with that obligation, so that we are giving the government, or excuse me, giving the prime contractor a price quote that considers that I'm going to have to pay my employees at least $15 an hour. There are other FAR clauses too. Speaking about mandatory flow downs, the equal opportunity clause is one that I cite a lot just because it is mandatory for any subcontractor purchase order over $10,000. In government contracting, that is a low number. So you can pretty much just go ahead, if you're thinking about getting into government contracting, go ahead and read that clause because you're going to be subject to its requirements essentially on almost any subcontract that you would come across in over $10,000. So in hopefully expanding your business, we want to get those contracts up over $10,000. So something to be mindful of. Next slide, please. So kind of summing it all up, when you are a subcontractor and you are negotiating with the prime, your subcontract, you know, obviously as a small business, can be difficult when you're dealing with a larger business because you may feel like you really don't have negotiation leverage or the ability to kind of push back on certain things. But with flow downs, taking the time to tailor the flow downs and make sure that you're just not agreeing to some blanket incorporation of all the prime contract terms. This will save a lot of headache for everyone, but it protects you as a subcontractor from potential issues down the road. The big one is cost. We'll use that minimum wage FAR clause as an example. If you bid the contract not knowing that you had to pay your employees all at least $15 an hour, and then you proceed to performance and someone realizes that you're not in compliance with that clause, you're going to owe that money to your employees. The Department of Labor is going to come after you, right? So we want to make sure that we are, we are not agreeing to FAR clauses or flow downs that don't actually apply to us, because if it's in your contract, you've agreed to it, right? If it's in, even though the clause may not be mandatory, if you've agreed to it in your subcontract, you may be bound to it. So make sure that you're understanding what it's going to cost you to comply with everything that's mandatory and everything that's going to be incorporated into your subcontract. Also make sure that you can comply. You may not have the facilities required to comply with some of the flow downs, and you just need to understand that if you're talking about negotiating with a prime contractor. And then also unintended interpretations. If you just get a blanket flow down from the prime, I've seen this a lot, where the prime contractor will just blanket flow down the entire statement of work to the subcontractor. You have no idea what you're supposed to be performing as it stands in the contract. You may have a verbal agreement, but if we go back to the contract, in theory, the prime could say, well, you agreed that you would perform X, Y, Z. So we want to tailor everything in our subcontract to what work is actually going to be performed, and make sure that we're only agreeing to flow downs that are mandatory or necessary, so that we're not incurring potential compliance risk or additional cost risk. Next slide, please. And remind me, do we have a hard stop at 11:30 or it's 12:30?
No, you're all good.
Okay, good. All right. So other negotiation points we want you to be mindful of as a potential subcontractor to a prime under a government contract. We want you to read the prime contract, the solicitation rather, and any incorporated documents. So getting a hold of the solicitation shouldn't be difficult. Typically, those are posted publicly on like an FBO.gov. The prime contract often will be referenced in your subcontract. So you may see the prime contractor put something in that says, subcontractor shall be bound to the prime contract to the extent that prime is, or something to that effect. If the prime references the prime contract in your subcontract, you're bound by it and you need to read it. And they may push back and say, no, that's confidential, you can't read it. And if that's the case, have them take out that reference to the prime contract in your subcontract. Because again, we don't ever want to agree to anything that we don't understand, we haven't read. The same thing applies to incorporated documents. Very often you'll see just a few bullet points saying, we're incorporating XYZ specification. If you haven't gone and read those specifications to understand what's required of you, you may not understand the technical obligations that you're under in your subcontract. So you may get down the road and deliver something to the prime. They say, look, that's great. Then they deliver it to the government. The government says, whoa, that doesn't comply with this specification. You got to redo it. And that cost and that risk will be on you as a subcontractor. So again, we have to be very careful about a prime who, and again, this is not intended to insinuate that primes are trying to push all the risk onto the subcontractor, but oftentimes as an administrative matter, it's just easier for primes to push down a lot of requirements onto subcontractors, and then they're generally protected in the event that the goods are non-conforming or there's an issue with the services. And if they want, that risk really can fall on the subcontractor. So we just want to be careful and understand everything that's being asked of us in the subcontract. Another negotiation point and something to consider is to cover risks that are not addressed in the prime contract. That bullet might be a little misleading, and I want to kind of zoom out. Government contracting is unique. The government has rights as a contracting party that commercial normal parties would never agree to, right? In the normal world, no two parties would ever agree that one party has the right to terminate a contract for convenience whenever the government wants, or whenever that party wants, for whatever reason, and not have to pay lost profit or not have to pay lost wages for the unperformed portion. That is a unique ability of the government in government contracting. It is not a unique right that the prime gets as to the subcontractor. However, you will very often see prime contractors put terms in their subcontracts that say, hey, I get a unilateral right to terminate the contract for convenience whenever I want, just like the government. So the illustration I'm trying to bring out here is just because the government may have a right as to the prime, you as a sub don't always have to accept that same flow down or type of right asserted by the prime as to you, the subcontractor. You guys are still commercial parties. So, and the caveat there is, the government can still kind of terminate your subcontract through the prime. There may be some things that are caveats or exceptions here, but as a general matter, if you see that unilateral right to terminate your contract for convenience, you can push back and say, no, you've got to we've got to have some mutual agreement, or I need 30 days notice, or things of that nature. So again, just because the government has the right to the prime doesn't mean you have to accept it as the sub to the prime. Same thing with changes. Under most contracts, commercial being an exception, but the government has a unilateral right to make changes to the contract. We don't want to give the prime the right to unilaterally change your subcontract. When I say unilaterally, I mean they get to change it on a whim, and you have to accept it and continue performance. We want to make any changes subject to mutual agreement of the parties. We want to make it a requirement that any changes to the schedule, you get an opportunity to reprice your work if you need to, things of that nature. So again, just because the changes clause may allow it between the government and the prime, you don't always necessarily, or you can at least attempt to negotiate it as a subcontractor to the prime. Same with disputes and venue. Venue, I point out, as a sub, appreciate that you may get into disputes with the prime contractor, and you do not want to agree to a venue provision that makes you have to, if you're in Florida and the venue provisions with an Alaskan native and they want any litigation to occur in Alaska, that is prohibitively expensive for you. So try to find, there are neutral fora that typically larger companies will agree to, like Virginia, New York. So just be mindful of, you hope you don't get into a dispute with the prime contractor, but you always need to plan for it. So try to avoid those venue provisions that put you into expensive or odd forums. And then last, we would want you to be so careful on protecting your IP interests. Similar to something like the termination for convenience provision, the government gets unique rights in intellectual property. So if you are delivering anything with your IP in it to the government as a prime contractor, if you developed that IP at private expense, you can assert license rights to the government to essentially say, hey, government, I don't want you to be able to use this with other contractors, my IP rather, because I developed it at private expense. But if the government pays for the development of any IP, they get an exclusive, paid up, worldwide, universal license to use your intellectual property. And as a practical matter, that means that they can give what's developed under the contract with government funds to another contractor, or they can put it out to bid. They can use it as a specification. So we want to be very careful that if we truly develop something at our own private expense before working on the contract, that we assert those rights and protect that IP from both the prime and the government. So there's two ways. There's essentially kind of two. We'll call it a flow up. There's two flow ups that we need to think of. We want to make sure that in the subcontract, you're not agreeing to give your intellectual property rights to the prime. You may see something like the words work for hire, or that you would assign your rights and intellectual property developed under the subcontract to the prime. You don't have to agree to those clauses. And actually, the defense FAR supplement actively discourages the prime from using their negotiation position as leverage to take away intellectual property rights. But just be on the lookout for those clauses. If you develop something, you get intellectual property rights, even though the government may get its own. And again, I'm speaking in broad generalities, but don't give away everything to the prime. And then make sure that if you develop something at private expense, you assert and you tell the prime to assert to the government your rights in that data or software. So the prime has to tell the government, hey, we're going to be delivering X software with restricted rights. And in that way, the government can't just shop around your software or intellectual property as though you didn't invest your own funds into the development of that software or data. So that, again, is like a very high level example, but I just want always be mindful of what the intellectual property clauses say, especially if you're going to be doing some development on a product that is, often with small businesses, your software or your product may be kind of your bread and butter, your only product that you have. and just the opportunity to get into government contracting. We just want to make sure that we're still being protective of our base IP and our base product. So those were kind of our other points we wanted to talk to you about today, and I think that may be my last slide. Yes.
Thank you, Sarah, for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who attended. The recording and slides from today will be available within about 24 hours. Those slides will be on slideshare.net, and the recording will be on our YouTube channel. So you can go back through and rewatch all of the data points from Archisa Meehan, as well as all the legal insights from Sarah Osborne from today. So thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you next week. So this concludes the webinar. Have a great day.